Recording in progress.
Hi to everyone who's just joining us. I'm just going to wait a few moments and then we will begin the webinar. Hello everyone and welcome to the Institute for Molecular Science and Engineering's webinar. Today, Sustainable African Agriculture Across Scales, from Molecular Diversity to Socio-economics. My name is Leah Adamson and I am the IMSE Events and Communications Manager. So this webinar is part of our series showcasing our 2022 seed funding. And so we'll be putting some helpful links into the chat function. So these include links to the IMSE Eventbrite page, where you can find the registration for all our upcoming webinars and any of our highlight lectures and also our annual lecture. The IMSE YouTube channel, where you'll be able to view all our previous webinars and they'll be uploaded. Also our blog, the Never Lick the Spoon podcast, all of our previous briefing papers, and also the registration for our newsletter, so that you can keep up to date with all of our news and events. So just a few top tips to make sure that we have a really good webinar. Your microphone should be muted and your video switched off as a participant, but please do just double check that they are. If you wish to ask a question, please put the question into the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. Your questions will be answered all at the end by our fantastic panelists. Please don't put any questions in the chat function. If you have any technical difficulties, please just message me on IMSE Imperial privately and I'll help you where possible. So I will now hand over to our fantastic presenters for today. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going first. So I'm Vincent Savolainen and I'm a professor in life sciences. And with Tilly Collins from the Center of Environmental Policy and 3 of our students, Ben, Erica, and CEO, we just want to talk about our project, which is combining actually molecular survey and economic model to do something about African agriculture and its sustainability. So, next slide. Yeah. Just a bit of background. I'm actually, my work is mostly on speciation genomics, and I've been working on the evolution of palm in various places around the world. And it often involves actually genes for stress tolerance, whether it's salt or drought. And that's how they sort of get adapted to new habitats and evolve into different species. And from this sort of pure biological work, we got some ideas about translation of some of this work in crop palm. And so with Tilly, we looked at coconut palm and oil palm in Africa. These palms are very important for the future of their agriculture. Côte d'Ivoire, for example, is the first exporter of coconuts in the world, and the oil palm is obviously also extremely important, mostly in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa. Ghana has massive plan, as you can see from these figures. So on one side, we have these crop palms that are really important for agriculture in Africa, but as we know, at the same time, there are main issue with deforestation. Because of the culture of this palm, there was this photo that was very famous with an orangutan trying to stop destruction of the forest in Southeast Asia. So we came up with a plan where we can sort of resolve all these issues. Next slide. And sort of that's the main idea, where we can have a series of components that would make the whole thing sort of going through circular economy, where on one side we can improve the resilience of the palm, so that proper genetics, looking at genes that would improve their drought and soil tolerance, so we could grow the crop palms in places that don't have any forest and that are so far not suitable for this culture. We could also use the waste of the palm industry to breed insects, for example. That would be a source of protein. We're not going to talk about this today, but we could also have a design of the management plan where we can do intercropping and actually have agroforestry ecosystem where we've got culture of palms, but also a rich biodiversity. And that's where the molecular techniques are going to come into play. Next slide. So we got this seed funding where we have a few objectives. On one side, we are going to hear now of a molecular survey of the biodiversity depending of different management of culture of palm. And if we can combine this with some economic model, then we can come up with a plan which we can put forward to some of the collaborators that we've got in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana, who are very interested in getting some new ideas of how they can go about their agriculture in the future. So that's my introduction, and I'll pass it over to Ben, who is going to talk about the first part of the plan.
Awesome, thanks for that, Vincent. Can I just have a little thumbs up, Tilly, that you can hear me? Awesome, great. So hi everyone, my name's Ben, and I'm just going to focus in on that first aim that Vincent mentioned, so that of kind of profiling above ground and below ground biodiversity under different management regimes in palmland. So agrobiodiversity is clearly very important for production and for yield. So functioning and diverse ecosystems provide agriculture with a variety of services, so things like pollination, soil fertility, as I'm sure you know. However, a lot of research has shown that tropical tree crop cultivation relative to natural habitats can actually detriment biodiversity quite heavily. So these are just two examples from oil palm on the screen at the moment. So on the left is just a meta-analysis from Foster et al. And they profiled a variety of mainly above ground taxa in species richness and total abundance. So the tail of the arrows in this case start in natural rainforest and the heads end in oil palm monocultures. So the main take home being that these arrows are generally going down and to the left, so reducing in richness and abundance, with very few going up or right. And on the right is a bacterial example. So this just shows bacterial community compositions under different land use systems. So we've got the natural rainforest in green relative to the rubber and oil palm plantations in orange and red respectively. So you can see that these bacterial communities are really quite altered in tropical tree systems relative to natural habitats. But despite this, there's actually a real lack of mitigative research. So this would be research to identify ways to manage highly productive systems for biodiversity, to include functional biodiversity. So this figure at the bottom is just a figure from a systematic map from a group over in Cambridge. And they basically mapped the prevalence of different types of research, again, in the oil palm literature. So they basically tracked how many publications were comparing the biodiversity value of natural forests to oil palm plantations, and compared this to the number of publications which were comparing the biodiversity value of differently managed oil palm plantations. And as you can see, they've identified that there's over 15 times as many publications comparing biodiversity value of oil palm to native habitats relative to comparing, in this case, monoculture to versus polyculture. So we really need to, oh, sorry, Tilly, if you could just go back a smidgen, thank you. So we really need to kind of combat this and increase the prevalence of research looking at different management strategies and ways to boost biodiversity with this. So these examples are all from oil palm, because actually there's even less work at the moment that's being conducted in coconut palm, which is kind of where we come in. So Tilly, if I could get the next slide, that'd be great. So we really wanted to kind of elucidate this relationship between plantation management and functional biodiversity in coconut palm plantations. So the idea behind our experimental setup out in Côte d'Ivoire is that we'd have coconut palm plantations split up into many different plots, as you can see in this top figure. So this is just a very crude graphic showing the experimental setup, showing a satellite view of that. So along the left-hand side, for instance, our plots might be split into different intercropping regimes, for instance. So the top one might be a coconut palm monoculture, and below that potentially intercropped with banana, and below that with cassava, for instance. And then next to that, we might have 3 different understory vegetation regimes, that sort of thing. So the idea was that we'd go into these differently managed plots and profile the biodiversity in them to kind of see this top-down impact of plantation management on functional biodiversity. However, when we actually got out into the field in Côte d'Ivoire, it became very apparent very quickly that unfortunately we weren't going to be able to assess the impact of intercropping on biodiversity, because this bottom left photo is an example of one of the intercropping plots from Marc Delorme out in Côte d'Ivoire. And unfortunately, as you can see, the palm trees and the banana in this case, which they're intercropped with, are very young and undeveloped, and obviously kind of not conducive to good biodiversity assessments. So this meant that we kind of had to focus more on the understory vegetation side of things, which was much more feasible with the kind of actual on the ground study system. So this bottom right picture is from one of the plots with no understory vegetation. So this is one of the ones that was grazed by cattle. I could have the next slide, please, Tilly. So we had 3 understory vegetation management types, so 3 different plots which were managed differently for understory. So these are shown across the top row. So firstly, we had the reduced or the no understory plot. So as I showed in the last slide, this was the one that was grazed by cattle. So you can see it's very bare ground. Then we had kind of an intermediary level of understory vegetation. So this in the middle at the top, that middle photo, is kind of 30 to 50 centimeters of natural herb layer, which is seen as the kind of optimal way to manage these coconut palm plantations. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have this kind of enhanced understory vegetation plot. So in the top right photo, this understory is well over head height, so it's kind of more bordering kind of an agroforestry approach, that sort of thing. So as well as these 3 understory plots, we had a swamp forest control, which is shown at the bottom. So you can, in the bottom left-hand photo, you can see me very pleased with myself that I've been given access to a machete to reach our swamp forest sites, which is shown at in the bottom right-hand photo. And we were profiling the biodiversity using soil DNA. So we took 5 soil samples per understory vegetation type. So 5 in the no understory, 5 in the intermediate, and finally 5 in the enhanced. And these soil samples, it just involves literally taking a 20 centimeter soil core and extracting 4 grams of soil from that. We took 1 soil sample from the swamp forest to act as our field control. And then we took an additional 5 soil samples in the no or the reduced understory plot. And these differed in the sense that they were deeper soil cores. So we took 40 centimeters of soil rather than 20 centimeters to kind of look at the impacts of like different methodologies on the communities we would get at the end. So that involved taking 4 grams of soil per sample, suspending that in just an RNA later preservative, freezing that, and then bringing it back to the UK. I could have the next slide, please, Tilly. So I think it's fair to say that this process kind of yielded a number of challenges. So firstly, in the field, it was a real blow to find out that we weren't going to be able to look at the impact of intercropping on functional biodiversity, because that would have been good to do. I also unfortunately came down with malaria whilst we were out there, so that reduced the number of soil samples that we were able to take. But the kind of major hurdle was kind of regulation surrounding the import of these soil samples. So these are obviously exotic tropical soil samples, and therefore they're quite heavily regulated by APHA, which, if you don't know, is just a government group which regulates animal and plant products. And this is quite a frequent challenge for this sort of tropical research, because obviously we wanted to get our soil samples over to the UK as quickly as possible to stop things like DNA degradation. So we had to go through the kind of import rigmarole, which is now done. Since they've been back in the UK, we've also had to get a permit for starting subsequent analyses, and that has actually just come through in the last couple of weeks. So DNA extraction from these soil samples has just been finished yesterday, which is good news. And now that both of these are in place, both these kind of import and analysis permits are in place, we can now look to do future work in the future, which would hopefully kind of go a lot faster. have the next slide, please, Tilly. So in terms of next steps on the soil samples that we've managed to collect, as I said, the DNA has now been extracted, which is good. So we've got the DNA extracts from each sample and each plot. And the way that we're going to profile the biodiversity and assign taxonomy to the DNA is with a process called meta-barcoding. So if you don't know, this generally involves selecting a marker gene or a marker piece of DNA which you're expecting to find in your sample. And then you would amplify that using specific primers for that marker, and then you would sequence that. And then we're going to use kind of established bioinformatic pipelines to assign taxonomy to these sequences, to these marker genes. So this just involves using kind of reference databases online for your marker gene. So they would have, for instance, a genetic sequence and the taxonomy assigned to that, and we would compare our two sequences and therefore assign taxonomy to our samples. So once we've got these communities, these values for kind of community richness and composition, we can have a look at the top-down impact of management on that. And you can see in this bottom right-hand photo, a picture of one of our collaborators holding a rather magnificent weaver bird nest, which was actually on the ground in one of our enhanced understory plots. So obviously hugely anecdotal, but kind of falls in line with the fact that potentially the more natural the understory vegetation management, the more natural communities you're going to find at the end. So we'll have to see about that. So in terms of markers, we're going for a variety of markers. We could use 4 in total. So to look for kind of metazoans and arthropod, particularly insect species, we're using 2 mitochondrial genes. We're going to use cytochrome oxidase 1 and 16S. For prokaryotes, so things like bacteria, we're going to use a nuclear 16S gene, and for fungi, we're going to use a nuclear ITS2 gene. And these are all really established markers in meta-barcoding. So the hope is that the reference databases online will be much more developed than they would be for other markers, and the communities we get out of it will be much more specific at the end, hopefully getting down to species level, but at least genus. And also these groups that we're going for, so arthropods, fungi and bacteria, we obviously have quite strong functional considerations. So there's really important groups in all of these. So for instance, pollinating arthropods, pollinating insects, that sort of thing, mycorrhizal fungi, which we're hoping to pick up, which are clearly very important for production. And also we can go one step further than that and actually directly create a functional profile to our samples. So for instance, there's bioinformatic pipelines that I'm sure some of you have heard of. So things like PyCrust, which takes the taxonomic profile, which you input it from our marker genes, and they will then predict using reference databases the functional gene content of the whole metagenome. So the metagenome is just all DNA, which we're going to find in our soil samples, and they will actually predict the functional profile. So as well as allowing to see the top-down impact of management on taxonomic richness and stuff like that, we're hoping to also see the impact of management on things like functional richness and functional composition, which obviously has kind of key implications for production. So with that, I'll hand over to Theo and Erica, who are going to talk a little bit about the socio-economic side of things.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Erica. I'm a PhD student at Imperial College, specifically at the Center of Environmental Policy. Theo, would you like to introduce yourself briefly as well?
Sure, I'm Theo. I'm a research assistant also at the CEP.
Yeah, so today Theo and I are going to present what we have been focusing on. We have explored the links between the intercropping system and the socio-economic aspect. The scope of our study is to build a crop production model that includes environmental and economic resilience, sustainability of resources, and societal benefits. We have conducted a rapid evidence review, which will also enable us to identify data gaps, and this presentation we will show you in this presentation we will show you how we mapped the interaction within an intercrop system. Next slide, please.
Here we go. This was our starting point of our intercrop system, or our alternative management system. This was to map out kind of the entire workings of an agricultural production system, focusing on coconut intercrop, but those kind of key nodes of main crop and intercrop can easily be replaced with other management techniques like grazing of livestock or understory cover, for example. Up on the top left, we've got our basic inputs. These are things like labor and fertilizer that are required for a farm system. And then that generally leads down towards the bottom left to our indicators of resilience. And these include things at a household level, like individual nutrition and food security, right up to a broader social and even national scale, like sort of population dynamics and land ownership. The aim of this was to kind of get everything down on the page to try and map out the entire system. It could have obviously gone even broader, looking outside of a single country, looking at export markets. But in order to kind of synthesize this down and get a functional model that could kind of act as a roadmap towards sustainable agriculture, we had to cut a few of these nodes and linkages out. So we condensed this map into something a bit more approachable. And what follows, Erica would explain, is a more straightforward analysis.
Yeah, so as Theo said, we condense that really big map into something more approachable, and what follows is a more straightforward analysis of the processes within an intercrop, which allows us to better identify where there is data already and where instead lie some gaps in research that can influence future advices to the agricultural industry, for example. Here, the keynotes are more represented with a bit more clarity. On the left-hand side, there are listed all the inputs divided for macro categories, which lead to an increase of cost for managing land and from an increase in labor inputs following the intercrop project kickstart. So the intercrops are linked with higher, diverse, and stable income throughout the year, with improved nutrition and diet diversification and climate resilience as an effect of the environmental outputs, which macro category listed here are improved water quality, soil health, genetic diversity of soil, crop, nutrients, and carbon sequestration. On the right-hand side, instead, we have the increased standard of living links, diverse diet, improved nutrition, and better environmental resilience of the crops. We can see that those are the main objective of the agricultural intervention. Next slide, please, Tilly. So to explore and build these linkages in our map, we conducted a rapid evidence review of the available literature. We firstly started focusing on intercropping as a sustainable farming method in West Africa, but we soon realized that there was fairly limited research available in this location. So for the reasons we have focused on building a base of literature evidence from coconut farming on one side, and the sustainable agriculture in West Africa on the other. And here below in this table, we have listed the literature browser we have used, like Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. As well, we have used some great literature sources and handbooks from which we looked at cited papers. The searches included broad terms like intercrop, climate, drought resilience, income stability, resilience livelihoods, climate smart agriculture, and soil agroecology, while search strings included combination of farming practices and outcomes, for example, coconut and intercrop and resilience, intercrop and child education, intercrop and gender issue, nutrition, and gender empowerment. Next slide, please, Tilly.
And these are our results. This is after applying our kind of exclusion criteria. We ended up with about 73 papers. The main results we were interested in for our model were the kind of general topics that each paper focused on. And those are the key nodes and linkages on the literature map that Erica just showed you. We were also interested in the outcome measure, what the paper was measuring as the kind of driver of resilience. And then that would kind of show us where there are gaps, where there's a strong evidence base for future research. In terms of locations, as you can see, there's a considerable amount of data on farming in Southeast Asia. That's unsurprising. Most large coconut exporters are in Southeast Asia. India, the Philippines all produce volumes of magnitude more than any African country at the moment. There are global papers as well. Those are mostly review papers looking at different farming methods on a broad scale. Generally speaking, African studies were more focused on sort of climate smart agriculture. As Erica said, there wasn't a huge amount of detail on coconut farming specifically, but there was some discussion of agroforestry, of, as I say, climate smart agriculture, different options for organic farming. Meanwhile, in Asia, there was a lot more focus on farming methods. Some papers almost acted as manuals for farmers, detailing how to set up an intercrop system, how to set up an understory system. And then over on the right, there's the outcome measures. And by this, we mean the kind of primary measured result of a paper. So what this author or these authors take as an indicator of resilience. As you can see, by far the most important indicator, and one that came up the most, was profit, closely followed by yield, and that's it kind of gives us an indication of what research and what industry is interested in looking at. There's a fair bit of information on soil nutrient availability, but generally speaking, the driver of success is seen as either baseline profit or baseline yield. If in kind of looking at a bit more detail, just you see on that right hand table, we've divided it up to examine whether or not there was a bit more information in different locations on one or other indicator. A bit more detail on crop outcome measures in Africa, so measures like pest and disease, and a kind of broader focus on soil in papers that focus on Asian systems. There wasn't a huge amount of detail on carbon sequestration or emissions. And importantly, as Eric will explain in a minute, there was very little on specific socioeconomic indicators. So things like gender and gender empowerment, employment, dietary and nutrition needs. That's kind of what we were looking for. And as you can see, slightly lacking in our results.
Yeah, so after gathering all the evidence in literature, we have allocated them in our maps, specifically on the links among the different nodes, aiming to visually highlight where research has been providing some or plenty of evidence, even in different environmental, socioeconomic contexts and in various countries, and when instead there is a gap in research. For example, there is one evidence covering the social aspect of gender empowerment, and also none in linking to what are the social benefits on child labor and child education in the long run. In fact, while we can assume that improving standards of living, socioeconomic and environmental resilience of rural communities, we can also improve that can lead to an improvement of their general livelihood and the children education and skills. In practice, there is a huge gap in the evidence leading to these conclusions. Next slide, thanks.
So just to sum up some of the key messages that we took from the literature, most of the papers we analysed were focused on the benefits of these farming systems. There were a number as well that detailed some of the maybe drawbacks and the costs, and we've included those in our kind of key takeaways, divided, as you can see, into crop level benefits and drawbacks, economic and social, and then wider and environmental costs and benefits. So starting maybe at the bottom with the wider environmental benefits, there's a pretty solid evidence base, as Ben suggested at the beginning of the presentation, that diversity of production, and especially intercropping, can have a considerable benefit for soil quality, namely building soil nutrition, making soils more able to sequester carbon, to retain moisture, improve pest and disease resilience. These were really well represented in our research, especially those papers in Southeast Asia. A lot of evidence for the connection between intercropping and alternative farming practices and high yields and higher incomes generally. What there was slightly less information on was as Erica mentioned, the wider social viability. So although they maybe have a benefit for the crop, in our case coconuts, like a healthier soil will mean a healthier crop, less information on how that yield or income can translate to the socioeconomic benefits, as Erica said. In terms of barriers, there can be a significant startup cost to a lot of these projects, rarely available to a smallholder farmer. And connected to that is the fact that these benefits that we've mentioned aren't always easily demonstrable. So income is quite a straight up measure, whereas soil quality can be a bit more complex to analyze, as Ben found. This links also to payback time, which can be quite long for certain interventions. So for an understory to first improve biodiversity and for then that to have an impact on the yield, and for that impact to then be able to be studied by us, and then for us to translate that as information for a farmer, can take a quite a long time. And farmers can be unsurprisingly skeptical of an uncertain practice like that. On that subject of complexity, understory management and intercropping often requires a fair bit more labor and machinery, and these inputs are generally expensive. So although a labor opportunity might be beneficial in some places, the areas of high rural to urban migration or such may be making it harder to start up these kind of projects. This follows on to further challenges. There's obviously a starting cost, which is going to be significant in some cases. It's not always available from government, and maybe even less so from buyers who aren't usually focused on these kind of intercrop systems that provide social benefits, more focused on a monocrop that might maximize yields. And then to finish off, maybe just to go over some options for future research. The most important avenue is obviously that right-hand side of our map, that Erica exchanged. So although we can be confident in saying intercropping and understory management have a benefit for palm systems, we need to make sure that these actually translate to social benefits. So to improve resilience, improve living standards, and that requires research into aspects like child education, child literacy, gender empowerment, and that kind of social issues. Lastly, there's this location-specific need for research. As we said, there's a strong evidence base for intercropping coconut, but that's all based in Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of opportunity for more work in the Ivory Coast, in West Africa in general.
Unmute myself, it's over to me now. Yes, there are lots and lots of subtleties. Can you hear me? Can I check that? Yeah. That we meet all the way through this. The first really sort of significant problem that we found, of course, was that sampling can be really challenging. So we wanted to have really good information about what was going on in the soils and what was under the intercropping regimes, but the intercropping regimes just weren't as developed as we anticipated they might be on the sites we were working on. We haven't had the opportunity to go back and look at further sites, but that will be interesting to do. But still, I think we're going to learn a lot using these molecular techniques about what we find in the soils, and we're going to give ourselves a bit of an a priori baseline for when we do find intercropping that genuinely returns data on what that does. We've, through this project, developed a really clear view on what's missing and where the gaps are. So we know that there's very little about intercropping coconuts on the wider ecosystem services that they provide. So there are some incidences of rattan, there's some literature that talks about things that they quite like to grow in there. A lot of it is about soil stabilisation because the coconuts actually grow on sand, by and large. They like these very well-drained soils. They're coastal by and large. So there's a lot of interest in using your intercrop in a more regenerative way and in a more stable way, so you have long-term intercropping, because that again contributes to water quality, which is a gap, and helps us to improve the carbon sequestration of these soils by not having a lot of annual agriculture going through. As Erica and Theo said, there's very little literature on the links between these diverse intercropping systems and human health versus via dietary effects. So do you have a better diet when you have access to a wider range of crops? But also, is your income more stable? So if you have a range of crops coming out of there and you're not relying on one principal crop, does the income stability really matter? And there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that it does, but there's very little demonstrated economic evidence that it does. There's very little synthesized literature around. So, and that is, I think, a gap that we will be able to contribute to through this, is to develop the basis of farm level stakeholder engagement on economic and environmental benefits. So the ecosystem services and the potential economic benefits. As you saw in the bit earlier, there's a lot on profit and there's a lot on yield, and they tend to be about monocultures. There's very little about polycultural yields and diversity of income streams in that way. We also have this really intriguing perceptual challenge in that intercropping and the kind of polycultures were very much part of traditional cultures. When people had small holdings, everyone grew a bit of anything. But that large scale kind of high input agriculture is seen as advanced, and that the old polycultural methods which exist through history in West Africa and in many other places are slightly perceived as being retrograde. And in the UK, in America, we're seeing much greater evidence that regenerative agriculture, where you disturb the soil less and you go back to traditional regimes, has the potential to be extremely productive, both in terms of yield, but also in terms of the soil maintenance and the carbon sequestration of these systems. But that's going to be a big perception to overcome in Africa. We think that through this kind of work, we can probably make those small nudges to the bigger systems that will help them be less damaging as they develop. So being able to demonstrate that the yield stabilization and that the soil stabilization really can work as we go forwards by having an intercrop. So we need the persuasive evidence, and part of that is molecular, and part of that is going to be economic, and part of it's going to be the social outcomes, that we might be able to just nudge the big tanker of oil palm and coconut palm development into a more positive direction than has been the case in Southeast Asia, and to bring it down to more marginal lands through the work that Vincent does with the genetic improvements of these crops, identifying the right genes and being able to breed them in. And the molecular techniques are absolutely key to that, key to being able to see that we've got the right genes in the right plants, and to be able to replicate those plants very rapidly. So we've got communication challenges, we've got genetic work going into the future, we've got dying to see what comes out of Ben's analyses of the soil to see what baselines we're going to get. And I'd really very much like to thank IMSE for letting us have a bit of a go at trying to pull these things together and supporting us with the molecular work and tying it into this socio-economic stuff. So thank you all, and thank you to all our collaborators. Ben and Theo and Erica have been hard at work for the past few months, so thanks to them. Any questions? Do I do that? I can see a Q&A thing.
Yeah, I think there is one question, Tilly. Maybe you want to start and then I can answer. You can answer live. I don't know if somebody is going to lead us with the question, but yeah, there is one question. Do you want to go first and then I can add something?
The question is, what do you think will be the biggest challenge going forward with this project? I think each component has different challenges. Getting the right examples and finding enough coconut intercrops so that we can have persuasive sampling is going to be one. And at the other end, it's going to be persuasive communication.
I think I just wanted to add also, when we work on palm, so palm trees, they are long-lived trees. So to make the demonstration of any changes, for example, in yield, depending of a management structure, it takes years. So it is really a long process. Even some other stuff I do on experiments on palm trees for speciation, because they take so many years before they fruit. It's not like mustard or sunflower. So it's a different ball game in terms of the time frame. But it's at the same time super important, as we can see, the effect on deforestation in Southeast Asia is massive. So we need to tackle this one too. There's more questions actually.
Yep. So where do you see this research going in the next 5 years? Where do you think, Vincent?
So I think we will have science-based evidence of what would be the best management program that would allow best outcome for biodiversity, functional diversity, and so on, and also the economic value of the crop. So that would be done, and then we probably will have identify some genes that would be useful to maybe do GM palm. I think it's one thing that we want to consider for being able to grow them in places where there is no forest, and that they will be successful in terms of being the role of a crop. So not that they compete against biodiversity, but so yeah, GM palm I think is something that is going to come up quite soon at this time frame.
Yes, we've made quite a big effort to kind of map the stakeholders in the developing palm industry in West Africa. So we've kind of got the names and phone numbers of lots of people. And now we're allowed to have meetings again. And now we can actually get people and sit them down face to face. I think we'd hope that we're going to get some translation, and we hope that we can get some attention in terms of being able to show the evidence for a diversified system and for the stability and social economic benefits of a diversified system through being able to say, look, this is what the molecular work says. There's a question about what proportion of palm agriculture is intercropped at the moment. Very little big commercial interest palm agriculture is intercropped at all. The more incidental is, so in more sort of rural and less developed areas, everybody has a palm at the end of their garden and it exists in an intercropping context. But in terms of the big production stuff, it's a very small component of that. Ben, do you have any idea? Would you like to put any estimates on that?
Again, yeah, just kind of bouncing off what you were saying, is it's actually very, very hard to put a number to it, because it's all of the intercropping that's going on at the moment is in this smallholder setting, whereby mapping is extremely difficult. So I'd say, yeah, very, very hard to put a number on it, but completely agree that in terms of the big industrial plantations, very, very little.
There is, how easily do you think the research could be translated into a wider scale, for example, in industry? Vincent, would you like to comment on that?
I can mention that in Côte d'Ivoire, when they've created new varieties or new hybrid, and when a hybrid has a better yield or is a little bit more drought tolerant, they get very quickly very successful, and then seeds and planters are sold everywhere, and the farmers they take on very quickly. So I think if we were talking about sort of GM or new variety, that would probably work well. What we want to do is change the management practice. I think that's going to be a lot more difficult, and it will depend of sort of incentive that will be at government level. So I think as Tilly said, there is a big communication. We need to gather the evidence first, but at some point, if there is an incentive for doing agriculture that is biodiversity friendly, then it will work. But yeah, it will take some time. So I think that the new type of crop, or drought resistant and so on, will be first. Maybe then recycling the waste, like insects. There's a few farms and stuff that doing this, and then the biodiversity will come at the end.
Yes, there's a question from Isabella here saying, will the molecular nature of this work give it status? Perhaps a way of arguing that the trad agricultural approach is advanced. I really hope so. I really, really hope so. I think that will be persuasive and critically persuasive. But we have yet to see what the results are. You know, at the moment, we're rather assuming that the results are going to say there's much greater functional biodiversity in these soils, but we don't know that yet. Yep. Any other questions? Shall we then? Thank you very, very much then.
Yeah, thank you everybody, and I think we leave it there, right? I don't know if our host is going to say anything. But,
Leah, do you pop up? There you are.
Hiya. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending and to our panelists. It sounds like you're doing some fantastic work and we're really excited to see where it goes in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone attending. Have a nice day.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.